We've taken a look at some ways to simplify our code. And in this video, I'm going to introduce a new concept and look at events a little differently to see some other areas where we can work with them and make things a little easier on ourselves in the future. So of course, we have our set of tabs here. And I have each of these headers listening for a click. This does work fine, but there's another way to do it. So let's take a look at the elements inspector to discuss this. So I'm going to inspect one of these headers. So right now, there's an event listener on each of these H3 tags. So every time I add a new header, I need to make sure that it has an event listener. And we're currently doing this with a for loop, but there is another way. And that is using a concept called event delegation. So when you click something in your browser window, the object that you click will try and handle that event if there's a listener attached to it. And if not, something called event bubbling happens, where basically every parent element going up the outline in the document will try and catch that event until finally it goes away. So instead of adding many event listeners, one on each header, you can instead add an event listener to a single object that contains all of the ones that you want to potentially respond to that event. And then that element delegates the authority of responding to the event to those children elements down here in the outline. So before your eyes completely roll into the back of your head, let's take a look at how this might work in practice. So here we are in the code. And let's jump down to the bottom of the file and look at our event listener. So here we are. We're adding an event listener to every header in turn. Let's redo this. When we're talking about code, we call this refactoring. So let's refactor this to use event delegation instead. So instead of adding an event listener to each of these headers, I'm going to add it to the group. So let's switch back to the browser and make sure we know what we're doing. So I want to add this to the tab group. So I'm going to copy this ID and switch back. So I'm going to get rid of all of this and instead use the tab group. I'm going to duplicate this down here. Okay, so now I've added the event listener to the tab group, and then I have my activate tab function here. Because I'm only adding a single listener, I could change this to be an anonymous function. So let's just do that. I'm just going to cut this, get rid of those extra lines, and then where activate tab used to be, we're going to drop in this anonymous function. So now everything is all in one piece. Okay. But we still haven't actually done any delegation. Right now, if I try to do this, it's really not going to work. So what I need to do, first I'm going to comment out all the stuff that this was doing before. Okay. And I'm going to insert console.log, and then we're going to inspect this event argument that I left in there before but hadn't used. Okay. Now I'll save this and switch back to the browser. I'm going to open up my console and reload. So now this whole group is listening for events. Let's click around and see what happens. So you can see that as I click, I'm logging that mouse event object, and there's a whole bunch of stuff happening inside here. Let's look at the most recent one. One thing you can see looking up here is that this toElement property is changing. If I look down here, here's toElement, and also I have this target, which is a little shorter, but seems to be equivalent. So I'm going to check the target and make sure that the thing that I wanted to click is in fact a header. The way I can recognize that is by looking and seeing if it has the tab header class. I could also check the tag. But then if I wanted to change the tag itself to, say, a div or a header of another level, H2, H4, something like that, I'd have to change it. But odds are I'll keep this class the same. So what I'm going to do is say, all right, if my click event was targeted on one of these, let's respond to it. So switching back to my editor, I can get rid of this. And most of this is going to stay similar. So the way I had this set up before, I was using this. But now, because I'm looking at the event target, that is event, and then its target property, I'm going to save this. So I'm going to call this my header, because I'm assuming if this code is going to work, that the target is going to be a header. But first, of course, I have to check that. So let's see. If my header dot class name, because I'm going to look at that class name property of my header, is header class, then do all this stuff. So for this to work, I would need to surround everything down here in another set of curly braces. That's fine, but there's another way to do this. Instead, I'm going to check if the target is not a header, because there are potentially more targets that could not be headers than those that are. And if it is not, I'm just going to ignore it. In other words, I'm going to return out of this function. And once again, I could use curly braces here like this, but because it's only on one line and the only thing I'm doing is returning, I'm going to leave it on a single line. When you're working with JavaScript, if you can fit what you're doing on a single line before the semicolon, it's okay to do it this way. If you add more lines, I certainly recommend for readability to enclose it in curly braces like this. But for now, we're just going to return if we have not clicked a header. And if we have, we're going to keep going. So the only other things I need to change here, my ID is currently this.id, but this would refer to the tab group. I don't want that. I want the event target's ID. So I'm going to use my header and drop that in here. And then this will continue working. And now instead of reselecting by my ID, I can use my header again. So my header.className and set that up, and everything else can stay the same. So now I'll save this, switch back to my browser, I can close this and reload. And we're back. So my tabs are all working again. And as you can see, if I click in other places, nothing happens. It only works if I click the tabs. So this is great. I have everything grouped nicely. Everything seems to make sense. And one especially nice thing about doing things in terms of event delegation, which is something we're not doing here, but something that you can put in your pocket for later. If you were adding more headers using JavaScript, using event delegation means that you wouldn't have to add event listeners to each one as you add it. Every header that you add, as long as it has the same structure, will immediately respond to events. This works whether you're doing it by hand in the HTML or if you're doing it dynamically using JavaScript. So that's a look at responding to events using a different strategy called event delegation.